Unpredictable aggression, chaos versus Methodism. To a battle-hardened veteran of the German Wehrmacht, war was a professional trade, a science governed by established rhythms and predictable doctrines. When they faced the British, they saw a reflection of themselves, disciplined, methodical, and strictly bound by the book. But in 1942, that predictability vanished. To the German soldier, the American GI was an enigma. An enthusiastic amateur who didn't seem to know the rules of engagement, and that made them terrifyingly dangerous. While British units were known for their caution, often waiting for massive pre-planned artillery barrages and explicit confirmation from high command before moving an inch, the Americans operated with a jarring, almost reckless aggression. In the confidential reports of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi intelligence service, officers noted a lethal, instinctive American habit. When ambushed, instead of diving for cover to wait for instructions, American squads often reflexively charged straight toward the source of fire. They didn't retreat to reorganize. They doubled down. They escalated. This raw aggression was fueled by a staggering volume of fire. During the Normandy campaign, an American infantry division was capable of putting out roughly 12,000 rounds of small arms ammunition per minute of active engagement, a rate nearly 3 times higher than their British counterparts. This created a psychological friction the Germans simply couldn't calculate. A famous observation among German officers was that you couldn't predict the Americans because they didn't know what they were going to do themselves. Data analyzed by Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall highlighted this cultural divide. While only 15% to 25% of soldiers in traditional European armies were estimated to actively fire their weapons, American units maintained an active firing culture that sought to overwhelm German positions with 100% of available squad firepower immediately. By the time a German commander tried to exploit a tactical mistake, the GIs had already improvised a violent, off-the-script solution. They didn't win by outthinking the Germans. They won by outfighting them before the Germans could even think. Why every GI was a potential commander? In the traditional European armies of the mid-1940s, losing an officer often meant the instant paralysis of an entire unit. Both the British and the Germans operated under a strict top-down structure. Soldiers were trained to wait for a superior's whistle before making a move. But the Germans quickly learned a frustrating lesson. Killing an American lieutenant didn't stop the attack. It only changed who was leading it. This cultural obsession with individual initiative turned every American squad into a self-governing cell of resistance, a sharp contrast to the more rigid British hierarchy that German troops were used to exploiting. While a British platoon might halt to reorganize or wait for fresh orders after losing its leadership, American corporals and privates were culturally wired to take the reins immediately. They didn't see themselves as cogs in a machine, but as problem solvers. The most legendary example of this bottom-up grit happened during the bloody stalemate in the Normandy hedgerows. A simple sergeant named Curtis Cullen realized that their 30-ton Sherman tanks were being stopped cold by ancient, rock-hard earthen walls. In just 11 days, the U.S. Army had outfitted 60% of the First Army's tanks, roughly 500 vehicles, with rhino steel teeth to break through. German after-action reports are filled with accounts of this dangerous autonomy. Their commanders noted with annoyance that even when cut off and surrounded, small American groups averaging 12 men per squad continued to fight with 100% effectiveness, even when 50% of their command structure was decimated. To the Germans, fighting the British was like trying to break a chain. Fighting the Americans was like trying to punch a cloud of hornets. By 1944, statistics showed that American small unit commanders were granted up to 40% more operational leeway than British NCOs. You could kill the leader, but the swarm just kept coming. Rapid adaptation, evolution from defeat. For the veteran commanders of the Africa Corps, the initial encounter with American forces at Kasserine Pass in early 1943 was almost a joke. The Americans were green, their tactics were clumsy, and they suffered a humiliating defeat, losing over 6,000 men and nearly 200 tanks in a single engagement. The Germans, used to the British tendency to repeat the same methodical mistakes for months, expected the Americans to be sidelined for the rest of the campaign. But what happened next shook the German high command to its core. Instead of collapsing, the Americans treated the disaster as an intensive laboratory for improvement. While British doctrine often felt stagnant and overly cautious, the American military displayed a terrifying capacity to learn on the fly. In less than 30 days after their defeat in Tunisia, the U.S. Army overhauled its entire command structure, integrated its air support with ground units more effectively, and retrained its tank crews to handle German panzers at closer ranges. When the Germans faced these same units again just weeks later, they weren't fighting the same army. The bumbling amateurs had vanished, replaced by a force that had increased its tactical efficiency by an estimated 25% in a single month. This rapid evolution meant that by the time German soldiers developed a counter-strategy for one American tactic, the GIs had already discarded it for something far more lethal. The speed of this adaptation was backed by staggering logistical support. For instance, after losing those 200 tanks at Kasserine, the U.S. replaced them within days, whereas a German division would have been combat ineffective for months. By the time of the Sicily invasion, American fire coordination had improved so much that they were landing shells within 100 yards of their own advancing troops, a feat of daring and precision that even the most elite German units found suicidal. To the Germans, the British were a known static quantity, but the Americans were a virus that mutated faster than any defense could be built. Institutionalizing lessons, weaponizing experience. The real secret behind American dangerousness wasn't just individual bravery. It was a massive industrial-scale feedback loop that left the British and Germans in the dust. While the British tended to keep hard-won tactical secrets within elite units or specific regiments, the Americans treated combat experience like a mass-produced commodity. They institutionalized the process of learning. Every blood-soaked encounter in the hedgerows of France was meticulously documented through after-action reviews, AARs, and sent back to training camps in places like Georgia and Texas almost in real time. This meant that a fresh-faced American replacement landing in Europe in late 1944 often arrived with more up-to-date tactical knowledge than a German veteran who had been stuck in a trench for 2 years. The scale of this operation was staggering. The U.S. Army updated over 150 different field manuals in 1944 alone, incorporating specific ways to knock out the dreaded MG-42 machine gun or bypass a dragon's tooth fortification. This created a terrifying reality for German soldiers. They weren't just fighting the men in front of them, but a global intelligence system that was systematically deconstructing their every move. By 1945, the average American infantryman was carrying 88 pounds of gear, including specialized tools and manuals derived directly from lessons learned just 3 months prior. In contrast, German training programs had shrunk from 16 weeks to as little as 4 weeks due to manpower shortages, forcing them to rely on outdated 1939 doctrine. While the British relied on tradition and the Germans on individual genius, the Americans relied on a relentless flow of information. Every time a German sniper found a new hiding spot or a panzer commander used a new ambush technique, the information was processed, printed, and taught to 100,000 new recruits within weeks. By the time a new German weapon or tactic reached the front, the next wave of American recruits had already been trained on exactly how to destroy it. Trading material for lives, industrial war logic. To the German soldier, war was a professional craft defined by tactical finesse and the warrior spirit. When fighting the British, they encountered a similar, albeit more cautious, traditionalism. But the American approach was a psychological shock to the Wehrmacht. The Americans didn't try to outmaneuver the Germans with clever infantry plays. They treated war like a massive industrial project where the primary goal was to trade inanimate material for irreplaceable human lives. To the Germans, this wasn't just fighting, it was being crushed by an unfeeling machine. While a British commander might hesitate to level a historic village to root out a sniper, the American doctrine was brutally simple. If there is resistance, erase it with high explosives. This brute force methodology was backed by an astronomical consumption of resources. During the push across Western Europe, U.S. forces expended an average of 5-6 tons of ammunition for every single German soldier killed or captured. In contrast, the German army, crippled by shortages, often had to ration shells to just 10 or 15 rounds per gun per day. The sheer volume of this steel rain meant that German tactical brilliance was often rendered irrelevant by 105mm and 155mm howitzers. This philosophy extended to the very equipment the GIS used. While the British Lee Enfield was a bolt-action masterpiece, the American M1 Garand gave every soldier a semi-automatic advantage. Statistically, an American squad of 12 men could generate a volume of fire equivalent to a German platoon of 30 to 40 men equipped with Kar 98K rifles. This was the ultimate nightmare for a German defender. Your skill meant nothing when the Americans simply saturated your entire grid square with 100% more lead than you could return. By choosing to expend shells instead of men, the Americans created a war of attrition that the German military, despite all its professional training, simply could not survive. Jabo Terror, death from above. To a German soldier in 1944, the sound of a whistling engine was a death sentence. While the British Royal Air Force focused heavily on massive nocturnal strategic bombing raids to cripple German cities, the Americans brought the war down to the deck. They specialized in tactical air support, turning the sky into a permanent hunting ground. The Germans coined a terrifying term for the American fighter bomber, Jabo, and facing them was known as Jabo Todd, death from above. The primary instrument of this terror was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a 7-ton behemoth packed with 8.50 caliber machine guns and thousands of pounds of bombs. Unlike the British, who often operated in structured waves, American pilots roamed the French countryside in armed reconnaissance missions, attacking anything that moved. By the summer of 1944, U.S. tactical air commands were flying over 1,000 sorties per day. This forced the elite German panzer divisions to become nocturnal animals. They could only move during the few hours of darkness, averaging a pathetic 10 to 15 kilometers of progress per night. The psychological impact was absolute. A German commander could meticulously hide his Tiger tanks in a forest, but the moment a single American scout plane spotted a plume of exhaust, a swarm of thunderbolts would arrive within minutes. Statistical records from the Normandy campaign show that 70% of German tank losses during certain retreats were attributed not to American tanks, but to air-to-ground rockets and strafing runs. This was the ultimate unfair advantage. The Americans didn't just fight you on the ground, they paralyzed your entire world from the clouds, making 100% of daylight movement a suicidal gamble. To the Germans, the British were a threat on the front line, but the Americans were a threat every second the sun was up. Superior artillery, steel rain on target. To the veteran of the German Wehrmacht, no sound was more terrifying than the silent arrival of American artillery. While British artillery was undeniably effective, it followed traditional, slower fire control methods inherited from the First World War. The Americans, however, turned the battlefield into a high-speed, industrialized slaughterhouse. The secret weapon wasn't just the guns themselves, but the Fire Direction Center, FDC, a revolutionary command hub that allowed a single forward observer with a radio to coordinate the devastating firepower of an entire corps. To the Germans, American artillery was far more lethal than even the Soviet Stalin's organs because of its terrifying speed and surgical precision. The ultimate psychological nightmare was a technique known as time on target, TOT. American fire control officers used complex slide rules and synchronized watches to calculate the precise flight time of every shell from different batteries scattered miles apart. By staggering the firing times, they ensured that shells from 10 or 12 different battalions, up to 144 individual heavy guns, would impact the exact same coordinate within a window of just 3 seconds. The result was a total lack of warning. Unlike the British style, where the first few ranging shots gave defenders time to dive into bunkers, a TOT strike meant the sky wouldn't whistle for minutes. It would simply explode all at once in a massive, unsurvivable wall of fire. German survivors often spoke of the automatic and omnipresent nature of American fire. If a German squad so much as fired a single MG-42 machine gun, an American observer could summon a devastating barrage in less than 5 minutes. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery units fired a staggering 1,200,000 shells in just 14 days, maintaining a 100% saturation rate that turned dense, ancient forests into splintered graveyards of wood and bone. In many sectors, German prisoners reported that 75% of their total casualties were caused by these relentless shells before they even saw an American soldier. To the Germans, the British fought with brave men, but the Americans fought with a curtain of steel that made traditional infantry skill completely irrelevant. Logistical might, unstoppable industry. The final and most devastating blow to the German soldiers' morale wasn't a secret weapon, but a sandwich. By 1944, the German army was a force of horses and bicycles, with 70% of their transports still relying on animal power, and soldiers often starving on meager frozen rations. In stark contrast, the Americans were a fully mechanized juggernaut that seemed to ignore the laws of scarcity. Through the Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system of over 6,000 trucks operating 24 hours a day, the U.S. Army delivered 12,500 tons of supplies to the front lines every single day. The psychological collapse occurred when German prisoners saw the sheer insulting luxury of American logistics. While the Germans were scavenging for frozen potatoes and horse meat, they found American GIs eating hot turkey dinners and chocolate bars in the middle of a muddy, freezing forest. One captured German officer famously remarked that he knew the Third Reich was doomed when he saw a shipment of fresh cream-filled birthday cakes sent all the way from the United States to the front lines. It proved that the American supply chain was so efficient it could afford to transport sentiment and luxury alongside millions of rounds of ammunition. This industrial might meant that 100% of American infantry moved by truck, while German units marched hundreds of miles on foot, wearing out their boots and their spirits. The Americans didn't just have more tanks, they had the parts, the specialized fuel, and the recovery vehicles to keep 90% of their fleet operational at all times. By the final year of the war, for every one tank the Germans struggled to produce, American factories were churning out nearly 4. And they were powered by a supply of high-octane gasoline that was 10 times greater than what the entire German Reich could muster. Facing the British was a battle of military traditions. Facing the Americans was a battle against an industrial furnace that would never stop burning until Germany was reduced to ash. When German soldiers saw that even American privates had access to fresh socks, cigarettes, and hot coffee while they lacked basic ammunition, the will to fight simply evaporated. They realized they weren't just fighting an army, but a global economic titan. Thank you for watching this deep dive into World War II history. If you found these tactical insights fascinating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the front lines. What do you think was the most decisive factor for the Americans? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next one.